Welcome to Mainland, your local regional television station, coming to you from the Nelson and Tasman region. In today's news, government announces emergency response funding, tourists remain in stable condition in hospital, shellfish ban lifted, and regions such as Nelson leading recovery. Civil Defence Minister Nikki Kaye has just announced the government will pay $1.6 million to Nelson City Council and $317,000 to Tasman District Council for civil defence emergency response and recovery costs arising from the flood event in the Nelson Tasman region in December 2011. Ms Kaye says each council has the responsibility for an initial civil defence response in its area and then for recovery. She says she would like to acknowledge the important and significant work done by the Nelson and Tasman councils and thank all those individuals involved. Nikki Kaye says it's important for local authorities to know that central government is here to support them in major events with direct financial assistance. She says the aim is to cover the response costs and support the community as it focuses on recovery. She says these funds mean that ratepayers don't have to meet the full costs of such an event. The payments are a contribution to the costs the councils incurred responding to the flooding on the 14th of December 2011 after Takaka experienced 1 in 500 year rainfall and Richmond Nelson region experienced 1 in 250 year rainfall. Ms Kaye says the payments include a contribution to the ongoing costs of restoring river management systems which were severely damaged by the flooding. The financial assistance for the response period pays for essential civil defence costs incurred in accommodating, transporting, feeding and clothing displaced people and for repair of essential infrastructure and other response costs. Financial support for recovery contributes to repair or recovery of essential infrastructure assets, river management systems and other community assets damaged following failure of flood protection schemes. Mainland's Janine Pugh spoke with Nelson MP Nick Smith about the announcement.
Okay, Nick, the government has committed to a contribution of $1.7 million for the region for the recovery from the floods from 2007 in December. How do you think this needs to be spent by the councils, and have there been stipulations put on this contribution?
Well, this is part of the government's policy of standing by communities in tough times, and obviously Christchurch is just huge and we're spending billions. Equally, we need to be fair to regions like Nelson and Tasman with the major flooding event. It's about meeting the immediate costs of the infrastructure and the emergency event. So this $1.7 million does not meet all of our two councils' costs from that storm event, but is a substantive help. There is still work to be done on improving some of the infrastructure. I was with the Minister of Civil Defence this morning down in the Lower Saxton area where the infrastructure proved grossly inadequate for those flood events. The council still has work to do. I am monitoring the response from the councils. I've had properties there where homeowners and businesses have had water through their homes or through their premises 3 times in 3 years. Not good enough. And this money is about standing beside the council and ensuring that that stormwater infrastructure is improved. Truth is, if you get that sort of massive 1 in 500 year event, no stormwater system is going to be good enough. But it is simply not acceptable to have areas repeatedly flooded year on, year out, and that's where some of this money is going to go.
So do you think this is enough money to basically take the heat off the ratepayers having to top this up, or do you think it's enough, and will it take the effect off the ratepayers having to keep on paying?
The government funding is for specifically dealing with the cost of the emergency event. And so it's about replacing the infrastructure, and it's about the fact that there are quite high emergency costs of all the services that are required, the emergency centres in the event. It is not there as a fund for doing what councils can and must do, and that is to have infrastructure that is capable of dealing with major wind, storm and other events. I am confident that our two councils are getting on with that longer term work. The government can't be all of the solution. This is about a partnership, and that is why this 1.7 million represents part, not all, of the costs associated with that storm event.
Thank you very much for speaking with us today, Nick.
Always a pleasure to talk to Mainland.
The 2 women tourists who were injured in an incident at Franz Josef on the west coast on Sunday afternoon remain in a stable condition in Grey Base Hospital. The German and Japanese Dutch women, both in their 20s, were hitchhiking from Whataroa to Queenstown when they were picked up by the man who attacked them. Tasman Police Commander Superintendent Richard Chambers says police were yet to establish exactly what happened in the vehicle that resulted in one of the women suffering pelvic injuries and the other receiving 3 knife wounds to the neck. The 38-year-old man was arrested after a standoff that lasted more than 5 hours before the man was overpowered in the early hours of Monday morning and taken into custody. The women were visited on Monday morning by Richard Chambers, who updated them on what had occurred overnight on Sunday. He says naturally they're very relieved to know we've apprehended this man, however they're still extremely traumatised and upset after what they've been through, which is entirely understandable. He says along with medical attention they were receiving, police were providing as much support as possible, including victim support and liaising with families and embassies. The shellfish ban has been lifted in Queen Charlotte Sound and Tory Channel. The public has been given the all-clear to collect shellfish in Queen Charlotte Sound and Tory Channel. Nelson Marlborough Medical Officer of Health Dr Ed Kiddle says that 2 consecutive shellfish tests taken in Queen Charlotte Sound and Tory Channel have shown the levels of paralytic shellfish poisoning toxin in shellfish has returned to a safe level. He says although the algae bloom responsible for the toxin has been declining during March, it has taken several weeks for the toxin to be flushed from the shellfish. He says this particular bloom was sufficient to contaminate shellfish in the Queen Charlotte Sound and Tory Channel area, giving rise to a closure on February the 25th, 2014. Provincial regions across the country have led New Zealand's economic recovery from the global financial crisis. That's according to New Statistics New Zealand numbers released this week, Economic Development Minister Stephen Joyce says. Bay of Plenty, Gisborne and Hawke's Bay in the North Island, and Nelson, Tasman, Canterbury, Otago and Southland have experienced growth above the national average of the 5-year period from 2008 to 2013, while Auckland, the West Coast and Waikato have just been under the average. Meanwhile, Taranaki continues to generate the highest GDP per capita by some margin. Mr Joyce says this new regional data, which wasn't previously calculated, is the clearest indicator yet that it's our regional economies that have led New Zealand's recovery from the GFC. Nelson Tasman's GDP figures have just been released and it puts the region's value at $3.8 billion. Our region's GDP makes up for 1.8% of national GDP. Meanwhile, GDP per capita is $39,368, which is on a par with figures for the Hawke's Bay. And now Labour List MP Marion Street speaks with Gary Watson about issues pertaining to the elderly.
We hear some folks who are being treated very well and enjoy life in some of the retirement villages and facilities. But we do hear the odd other horror story of people that aren't doing so well. What would Labour do that National's not doing to address that?
First of all, we'd put in place a strategy where there is currently a vacuum about how we deal with our demographic of increasing numbers of elderly. We do not have a strategy around that. When we were last in government, we built up a strategy called Ageing in Place, which dealt with keeping elderly people as independent as possible. But now we're going to have many more people who want to work way beyond the retirement age. We've got people who have skills that they would like to impart to younger people. There's a whole lot of things that we can do to both look after and benefit from our elderly better. But in terms of elderly care, aged care, that is a real, a big issue for this country. And I think one of the first things we do is make sure that there are verifiable and monitorable standards across aged care facilities. So yes, you do get really good ones. Nelson has really good ones by and large. And then you get the little ones that seem to struggle to do anything remotely decent by way of care for their residents. So there has to be a standard. It has to be able to be monitored. We need to, quite frankly, pay the caregivers more. And if we're going to have a private sector dominated aged care sector where Ryman's and others of that ilk make huge profits out of the aged care sector, then we need to see some of that profit go back into the pockets of those who care for the elderly. At the moment, it's the care is largely by grace and favour, by conscientious effort on the part of the staff and minimum wages.
But then so is our fire service in New Zealand, relies on the same sort of thing. It relies on volunteers, and yes, there are some paid firefighters in the big cities, but in places here like Nelson, we've got a mixture of paid and volunteers, and the volunteers do a fabulous job.
They do, and we have paid and volunteer firefighters right around the country, actually. And
do you think they should be paid though, the volunteers? They're risking their life, they're protecting property, they're protecting the well-being and safety of people.
It's a difficult one, that one, because they're not required every day of the week.
No.
If we compare it with aged care workers, they are required every day of the week, and 24 hours a day. And they need to have a decent wage, not $14.25.
Where do we get the money from?
I think there needs to be some serious investment in wages rather than bricks and mortar. The Ryman's, for all that they provide an excellent standard in Nelson, are also the biggest building agent in this region. You know, you'd think it might be residential homes, but it's not. We have Ryman's is the biggest building contractor in this region, followed by G.J. Gardner. You know, so there are more rest homes and elderly care facilities being built than there are homes. There needs to be a rate for the job that reflects the skill base and the care that is put in.
And now Nelson Mayor Rachel Rees discusses the health of Nelson CBD. There's been a lot of talk about the Nelson CBD and where things are heading, you know, and there's been some anxiousness over the fact that there are a lot of businesses that seem to be closing, and in fact in the Nelson Regional Economic Development Agency report it does suggest that more businesses are closing than opening, and there does seem to be a movement in the Richmond area where, you know, there's bulk retail stores opening up, things like that, and just that general feel that potentially, you know, is Richmond going to end up being like the centre of the Nelson region? Do we need to fear that that's going to happen? I mean,
look, Joy, I don't think so. I think what we've got is a maturing retail market, and cities all around New Zealand have complementary offerings in terms of retail, and that's how we have to look at this. It's a little bit like any city in New Zealand. We have a commercial heart. The commercial heart is in Nelson City, and if I look at the retail figures that are coming through that I catch up with Uniquely Nelson, look at the credit card transactions that are coming through, they're actually very strong for Nelson City. You know, I think that's something we need to focus on.
yes.
We have a different offering to Richmond. That's a good thing. You know, it's an interesting market. We want different offerings as a community, but I think Nelson's strength isn't going to be in the large format, you know, major bulk retailing right in the heart of the city, because that's not what Main Street's shopping's around. Yeah, department store definitely, and you know, we're still working through that process with farmers. Farmers are still extremely keen to be located right in Trafalgar Street or one of the main streets in Nelson. That's a great place for them to have their store.
It sure is.
And look, the other thing I'm watching is actually new places opening. You know, there are new businesses opening up in Nelson. There are businesses closing. But I think you'll find the same things happening in Richmond, that you've got businesses closing actually more quickly than they're opening, and it's around that changing dynamic in retail. There's no doubt that online sales are affecting some businesses. You know, that's probably the biggest factor they have to look at. But for a council, one of the things that we'll be doing and is making sure that some things, it's critical that they work. So one thing is that the parking works for Nelson, and we have a parking study going on at the moment, and I think there is a degree of tension out there around the parking systems that operate. I have talked about some changes that I would like to see that allow less stress for people in terms of my parking ticket's going to expire and I've got to get a ticket, and that is a discouragement to shopping. I know it has that effect on me. If I've if I've paid for an hour and then I'm sitting thinking, oh, I would just like to go and do pop into another shop, I might not do that, and I think we can resolve that. The other thing that is important to making a CBD work is people. People. It's all about people. And if you think about, when do you enjoy Nelson the most? I know the day I enjoy Nelson the most, it's Saturday morning.
Oh yes.
Yeah, and it's because the town is busy, there are people around, the market's brought in a whole lot of extra people into the city. We've actually got less parking than any other day, but it's actually the most enjoyable place to be here.
That's right.
And I think when we look to the next 6 months, we've got some work about to happen on talking to our property developers in the city, talking to our retailers, bringing in some fresh thinking about how do you keep this an active, enjoyable place, and how do we get that next level of activity, which is people living in the city. We've got great ground floor retail offerings, but then we go upstairs and we've got some businesses operating from second floor, but I think we could have a lot more use of that CBD if we went up across the board, first floor, second floor, and maybe in some areas third floor. I think there's some work to do there. Council's keen to engage, and we want to hear what does the development community need from us, what do the retail sector, what do the hospitality sector need from us to make that happen. So some good news, and of course Quest Hotel coming on board, so that's fantastic.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Just one final thing with regards to this CBD. I have heard that there has been some concern about some businesses, say, like many businesses that are the same, of similar ilk, and then you get someone coming in from outside of town who also opens up the same kind of business, and another business closes because that business has opened, and there's competitiveness there. Is that good for the city?
I think that happens in retail across the country. It's a very, very competitive environment. Look, in a lot of the retail sector, the margins are very small, and you just can't sustain multiple similar offerings. Somebody's going to lose out, their business isn't going to survive. But it would be, I think...
So you wouldn't see it's council's job to
No,
monitor that?
I really don't. I think it would be highly inappropriate for council to enter into that market-driven system. It just wouldn't be a place for us. We wouldn't have the expertise, and that's part of the free market that operates in the retail sector. And the reason you have it is because in the end, how it should work is that the customer receives the best offering possible. So no, it would be, I think, quite a backward step if councils stepped into that role. What we do though is we do control the types of activities in a broader sense that go on in our commercial areas. So retail is important. That gets retail, hospitality, commercial offices. They get priority in terms of a planning regime that says your activities we really want here. We need to make sure that if they're the businesses we really want, we have a planning system that enables them to be there. So part of the review that you'll see following from the work we'll do with property developers and retailers is a real look at how do we reduce the red tape? How do we reduce the cost of doing business in the CBD? And if I said what's the most important thing that we do is that we work as an enabling council. We get rid of the roadblocks, we get rid of the red tape that actually isn't helping development. We make sure we're not expensive to do business with, so we help that. But I'd add to that the feedback that I get from Nelsonians is that they hugely respect the backbone of those main streets that they sit in from an urban design point of view as critical. They enjoy the shop frontages. you'll have heard the pushback about the blank concrete walls. Nelsonians don't like that. They don't see that as a way to develop the CBD and make it enjoyable. And we know that if you have a long stretch of concrete, brick, whatever it is, timber wall with no windows, that's a very disengaging street frontage. So I think we've got some work to do there. I think we could do better in terms of just protecting those street frontages and making sure they're still beautiful places.
Unique.
Yeah, it does.
Absolutely.
After the break, we'll bring you the latest weather update and some events and happenings coming up from around the region.